Assignment 3, Part 2. Creating the Jewish World of Today. More Big Changes. So far, we have examined the Jewish story up until the middle years of the 19th century. If we look at the Jewish world today, some 150 years later, we see that the situation is totally different. Major Jewish centres have disappeared, whilst others have grown out of all proportion. What has caused the changes? Let us take a look at 6 modern factors that have shaped the Jewish world, and particularly the European Jewish world that we live in today. Number 1, events in Russia at the end of the 19th century. Number 2, the Holocaust. Number 3, Zionism and the State of Israel. Number 4, the fall of communism. Number 5, economic factors influencing migration. Number 6, assimilation and intermarriage. Number 1, events in Russia at the end of the 19th century. 1881 was a terrible year for Russian Jews, the majority of whom lived in the Pale of Settlement, the vast area to the west of Russia, see the map by this hyperlink, in which Jews were restricted to live. They suffered brutal pogroms following the assassination of the Tsar of Russia, Alexander II, whose death was largely blamed on the Jews. It is true that these pogroms were the immediate catalyst for the soul-searching and mass exodus of Jews from Eastern Europe. But this is not the whole story. The pogroms were directed against a Jewish community that was already starving to death. The area of the Pale of Settlement was badly underdeveloped, and the Jewish community was particularly hard hit by discrimination. They were hardly allowed to own land, and they were forced into non-profitable jobs. This would have made life difficult in any circumstances. But in addition to this, the 19th century saw a major population explosion among Eastern European Jews. From 1800 to 1880, their numbers rose by over 500%, from 1 million to 5 million. With the economic situation already bad, the result of this population explosion was widespread poverty and starvation. The community and its institutions were in a state of collapse. It was against this background that the pogroms struck. Millions of Jews decided to leave Russia and Eastern Europe entirely. They set out for North America, the Golden State. They believed that America would offer a new start and new opportunities to its immigrant communities. Not all of the Jews who left Russia and Eastern Europe actually ended up in North America. Many ended up in Western Europe, especially the United Kingdom, and others ended up in South America. But the majority did arrive in the United States, 2 million in the years following 1881. Most of these Jews arriving in the USA experienced a very difficult reality, a reality which was far removed from their dreams and hopes. Many ended up working in sweatshops, clothing factories employing workers at low wages for long hours and under poor conditions in the big cities of New York, Philadelphia and Chicago. Large Jewish ghettos with all sorts of social problems developed in these and other cities. In fact, the Jewish population remaining in Eastern Europe, still at 5 million on the eve of World War I in 1914, experienced something similar. Many of the remaining Jews got pulled into the big industrial cities of Warsaw, Lodz, Białystok and Odessa. Large working-class Jewish communities developed in these cities. After all, this was where the new jobs were. But working conditions were not at all good. Subsequent generations of Jews in North America did not experience such brutal conditions as their parents and grandparents. they were able to work themselves up to a much better social and economic position. However, this contrasted with the lives of Jews remaining in Eastern Europe. The vast majority remained poor because of the entire area's limited economic growth and the discrimination still affecting Jews. 2. The Holocaust. The Holocaust destroyed the vast majority of Central and Eastern European Jewry and altered the map of the Jewish world forever. From 1939 to 1945, the total Jewish population fell from approximately 16.6 million to 11 million. Of those who survived, few wanted to return to their pre-war homes. Hundreds of thousands made their way to Palestine, which became Israel in 1948, the Americas, Western Europe, Australia, and South Africa. The impact on these communities was enormous. Memory and awareness of the Holocaust became one of the centerpieces of Jewish identity. Zionism and the State of Israel. In 1800, the total Jewish population of Palestine was only a few thousand. After the first Aliyah, wave of immigration of 1881, and the second Aliyah of 1914, the population came to approximately 90,000. From the mid-1920s until the end of the 1930s, the Jewish population increased more rapidly to over 425,000. Before the declaration of Israel's independence in 1948, the Jewish population stood at over 600,000. Over this period, the ethnic makeup of the Jewish population in Palestine, Israel, changed dramatically. Before the large waves of immigration in the 19th and 20th centuries, most Jews in the land were of Sephardi origin. Apart from some groups of immigrants from Yemen, the vast majority of the new immigrants were Ashkenazi and from Europe. This is not surprising. Zionism, the belief that Jews have a right to rule over themselves in their own land, was a significant driving force behind these waves of immigration, and Zionism developed out of a context of nationalism and patriotism in 19th century Europe. As a result of this shift in ethnic balance, the new state of Israel was essentially a creation of Zionist Ashkenazi Jews. One of the first decisions of the new state of Israel was to loosen its immigration policy, which had been heavily restricted by the previous British rulers. Immigrants poured in from two distinct groups. The first was survivors of the Holocaust. The second was Mizrahi, Eastern Jews, in particular from Iraq, Yemen, and Morocco. These Mizrahi communities were moving on account of both Zionist propaganda and anti-Jewish, anti-Israel feeling in their Arab homelands. Between 1948 and 1952, Israel absorbed 680,000 immigrants. Inevitably, this resulted in various social tensions and social problems. Many Jews continued to come in the 1950s, especially from Poland, Romania, and Morocco. Following the Six-Day War in 1967, there was substantial immigration to Israel from the English-speaking world and from Western Europe. From the early 1970s, immigrants from the Soviet Union began to appear in Israel, after intense pressure placed by the Western world on the Soviet authorities to allow Jews to leave Soviet countries. About 140,000 had arrived by the end of the 1970s. This number increased hugely in the late 1980s and in the early 1990s. Remember that the Soviet Union collapsed in 1991. By the end of the 20th century, immigration from the former Soviet Union had reached 0.75 million. Another important Aliyah was the Ethiopian Aliyah, mainly in 1984, Operation Moses, and in 1991, Operation Solomon. This brought an almost unknown new element into the state of Israel and to the consciousness of the Jewish world as a whole. It was both a source of great pride to Israel and a cause of great frustration and difficulty because of the difficulties in absorbing this section of the population. Why have all these people come to Israel? In order to answer this, we need to examine two sets of factors: push factors and pull factors. Push factors are the things that make a person want to leave their home. Pull factors are the things that attract them to a specific new place. The early Zionist Aliyot were largely made up of people who experienced both push and pull factors. They could not continue to live in Eastern Europe, and they felt that living in a Jewish society, living in the land of Israel, was an attractive option. For the Jews who came to Palestine as refugees and survivors of the Nazi regime, the situation was different. Their main motivation was not because they thought returning to the land of Israel was an attractive option. Rather, they had no other good option for where to live. However, when they actually arrived in Palestine, Israel, many turned into very strong Zionists. More recent Aliyot have been more motivated by pull factors. Economic reasons were important for immigrants from the former Soviet Union. Messianic dreams and hopes of moving to Israel were important for Jews from Ethiopia. What has been the result of so many different groups of people moving to Israel? One of the most interesting results was that the different groups' separate identities were actually reinforced on moving to Israel. This was in contrast to the ideal Zionist vision of the melting pot, where each group became subsumed under a common Israeli identity. Instead, different groups preserved their separate identities, fueled by tensions between them, and a sense amongst many that they were looked down on by others. So, although the Jewish diaspora largely vanished in many parts of the world as a result of Aliyah to Israel, many of the identities of these diaspora communities were preserved to some extent in Israel itself. The fall of communism. As mentioned above, the Holocaust wiped out virtually all Jewish life in Central, East Central, and Eastern Europe. In these regions, substantial communities only remained in Hungary and in the central and eastern parts of the Soviet Union. However, communism made any kind of meaningful Jewish life impossible. Jewish culture was only recognized in a very limited way, and members of Jewish communities always felt themselves under suspicion. For all but the most determined Jews, living an openly Jewish life was not an option. As a result, Jewish life either went underground or simply ceased to exist. Parents were unwilling or unable to pass on anything positive connected with Judaism to their children. Jewish identity became a stigma, and many people worked hard to distance themselves from any suspicion of being Jewish. The small exception to this Jewish standstill was in some areas of the Soviet Union in the late 1960s, where Jewish and Zionist identity became connected with opposition to the authorities. Some young Jews set up underground circles where Hebrew and Jewish culture were studied. These circles were important, but very small scale. When the Soviet Union collapsed in 1991, it was unclear what would happen from a Jewish point of view. Would Jewish people be willing to define themselves as Jews and reveal their hidden identities in a social environment which would not necessarily be any more accepting than before? In response to this uncertainty, world Jewish organizations stepped in and invested huge resources in the region, providing cultural, welfare, and religious services. Gradually and hesitantly, Jewish communities started returning to life. More and more people, including many who had never acknowledged their Jewish identity before, began to connect with their emerging Jewish communities. The main areas of activity were in Hungary and in the former Soviet Union. However, other smaller Jewish populations also showed significant signs of activity. In Poland, in the Baltic states, Latvia, Lithuania, Estonia, and in the new states created out of former Czechoslovakia and Yugoslavia. For the next generation at least, these areas will provide unique examples of an expanding Jewish diaspora population. Large financial resources continue to be spent on Jewish schools, informal education, and cultural networks, all working to reverse the negative image of Jewish identity. With more and more people in these regions wishing to identify as Jews, things are changing fast. That is the end of part 2 of assignment 3. There will be one further part 3, to follow.